At first glance, Jared Armstrong appears to be an easygoing individual, content to enjoy a relaxed pace of life in his tidy, unassuming cottage. A retired big band saxophonist by profession, he now fills his days tending to his yard, reading the occasional music score, and occasionally reflecting on the years he spent traveling and performing. His transition to a calmer existence seemed complete, until one particularly odd encounter threatened his sense of peace and, unexpectedly, his freedom. According to Jared, everything started one afternoon when he was in his garage, sorting through boxes of old memorabilia, from tattered sheet music to worn-out stage costumes. While he reminisced on the phases of his musical career, a knock sounded at the front door. Answering it, he was met by an acquaintance making what had to be the strangest proposal Jared had ever heard: "I want to buy your place for $1." The sheer absurdity of that statement momentarily left Jared speechless. No reasonable explanation followed the offer. It wasn't a negotiation, nor was it a jest among friends. It was a seemingly genuine attempt to purchase his cottage for a single buck, an outlandish move rooted in the notion that the neighborhood would be better off without him. Though Jared politely refused, the conversation took an unexpected turn when the would-be buyer insisted on pressing the matter. $1, in her eyes, was a fair bid to improve the area. The situation escalated faster than Jared could have imagined. The next thing he knew, the same individual, a figure known in the community for meddling in others' affairs, called the police. Allegations surfaced that Jared had threatened her, an accusation he categorically denied. Confused and annoyed, Jared nonetheless tried to remain calm when officers arrived to question him. To his dismay, the fiasco took on a life of its own once the officers started listening to the so-called victim's account of events. She painted a story of intimidation and harassment, all supposedly triggered by her innocuous, if bizarre, dollar offer. As Jared explained his side, emphasizing the ludicrousness of the proposition, he noticed their initial skepticism slowly giving way to comprehension. Although the police weren't particularly amused, they seemed to grasp that the entire dispute hinged on a highly unorthodox and ultimately meaningless transaction attempt. The fact that a person could be accused of hostility simply for refusing a symbolic dollar purchase baffled Jared. His life, up until then, had been all about melodies and performances, never overshadowed by anything resembling legal troubles. Yet here he was, standing on his own doorstep, justifying why he refused to part with his cottage for a single piece of currency. It struck him how petty grievances could balloon into situations requiring law enforcement intervention. This encounter introduced Jared Armstrong to the unpredictability of neighborly relationships, especially when influenced by those who wield personal agendas under the guise of communal betterment. Reflecting on the ordeal, he realized how fortunate he was that the authorities recognized the absurdity of the claim. Still, the event left him questioning just how easily one's quiet life could be disrupted by a single ridiculous offer, and how precarious stability can become when individuals with outsized authority decide to test the boundaries of reason. Since moving into his cozy bungalow on Elmwood Lane, Jared Armstrong had embraced a slow-paced lifestyle characterized by daily saxophone practice, gardening, and the occasional neighborhood chat. Yet, all that tranquility seemed in jeopardy thanks to Karen, the self-appointed overseer of the HOA. Early on, Jared discovered that Karen possessed a peculiar obsession with every detail of the properties around her, especially his. The first sign was a polite-sounding but unmistakably disapproving note that arrived in Jared's mailbox, cautioning him about unsightly garden gnomes lining his walkway. Karen, who apparently patrolled the area each morning with a clipboard, found the whimsical ornaments offensive to her sense of uniformity. She also took issue with Jared's vibrant hibiscus bushes, claiming their color clashed with the neighborhood's earth-toned palette. Despite the trifling nature of her complaints, Karen was relentless, citing obscure HOA bylaw clauses that might or might not actually exist. What truly stirred her ire, however, was Jared's deep love for jazz. He practiced saxophone most afternoons, savoring the freedom of no longer performing under the pressure of touring. To him, it was a joyful pastime, one that let him reconnect with melodies he once played for sold-out halls. But to Karen, it was a source of endless aggravation. She insisted the music was intrusive, lodging formal grievances about noise pollution to the HOA. Never mind that Jared played at respectful volumes and ceased before sunset. Some neighbors shrugged off her fussing, even expressing that they found Jared's sax playing enjoyable, a pleasant ambience amid the routine suburban hush. But Karen was unmoved by that consensus. She positioned herself as the guardian of quality living, claiming that Jared's garden decorations and saxophone constituted an assault on the neighborhood standards. The more others appreciated Jared's hobbies, the more determined Karen became to regulate them out of existence. Jared, ever polite, tried to offer small compromises, like rearranging the gnomes to a less visible spot and ensuring his music sessions ended well before quiet hours. Yet each concession only invited fresh nitpicking from Karen. New notes tucked into his door, or pointed remarks delivered in clipped tones whenever she passed him on the sidewalk. He realized with a sinking feeling that no matter how cooperative he tried to be, Karen's demands would never be fully satisfied. Through it all, Jared maintained a steady composure. Perhaps it was his musician's discipline, honed by years on stage, that helped him remain calm when confronted by someone bent on picking at every minute detail. But he couldn't ignore the undertone of personal animosity pervading Karen's campaign. Her determination to eliminate his nuisances bordered on the obsessive. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a chain of events that would catapult his benign life into a clash of wills, and eventually, the most absurd confrontation he'd encountered since he first picked up a saxophone. One Saturday, as Jared Armstrong was pruning his thriving hibiscus bushes, Karen approached him with a proposition so bizarre he nearly dropped the pruning shears. She stood at the edge of his lawn, a determined look in her eyes, and announced that she wished to purchase his entire home, for $1. At first, Jared thought she was making a joke. The only time he'd heard of a house selling for $1 was in a tall tale or a city's revitalization program. But Karen's expression was dead serious. "I'm prepared to offer you $1, in cash, for this property," she declared, as though it were the most natural statement in the world. "It'll be beneficial for both of us. Your decorations and saxophone practice are bringing down the neighborhood's tone, and I believe you'd be happier elsewhere." She lifted her chin, seemingly convinced that her words exuded generosity rather than absurdity. Jared struggled to grasp the sheer gall behind the proposal. Of course, the notion was ridiculous. He'd invested substantial time, energy, and funds into his modest but beloved home. He had no intention of selling to anyone, much less for a symbolic single dollar. Politely yet firmly, he declined. "I'm sorry, but that's not a serious offer," he said, hoping she'd realize how outlandish she sounded. But Karen persisted, insisting that a swift sale would solve their tension, claiming the rest of the HOA agreed that Jared's aesthetic choices and music were unwelcome distractions. She even pulled a crumpled bill from her pocket as if brandishing a check for $1 million. "Consider this my official bid," she said with a self-satisfied smile. A flicker of anger flashed across Jared's usually calm features. He mustered civility, explaining that his house wasn't on the market, not at any price, and definitely not for a single dollar. The real estate in the area was robust, and if he ever planned to sell, he'd have no shortage of legitimate offers. The more he spoke, the more annoyed Karen seemed, as if his refusal was an affront to the neighborhood's greater good. Sensing the tension, a neighbor out walking a dog paused to watch, uncertain whether to intervene. Jared eventually stepped back from the conversation, hoping to end the discussion by resuming his pruning. But Karen was not deterred. She warned him that if he continued to flout community standards by refusing a straightforward solution, there might be consequences. The ominous undertone in her voice made Jared's skin crawl. It wasn't until later that night, as Jared reflected on the bizarre encounter, that he realized just how far Karen might go to have her way. Offering $1 for his house seemed more like a provocation than a transaction. If she took such a stunt so seriously, Jared wondered what else she might do if he didn't cave in. Little did he know, her next step would involve bringing the entire might of law enforcement into a conflict that was neither rational nor remotely warranted. The day after the $1 offer fiasco, Jared Armstrong had just begun his routine saxophone practice when he heard loud knocking on his front door. Opening it, he found two uniformed officers on the porch, flanked by Karen, who stood a few steps back with her arms folded across her chest. The officers, evidently responding to a 911 call, approached with a mix of caution and confusion. "Sir," said the lead officer, "we received a report that you threatened your neighbor and caused emotional distress." His tone was careful, as if he'd heard such accusations before but couldn't yet judge the credibility. Jared, forcing a patient smile, gestured for the officers to step inside or remain on the porch, wherever they felt most comfortable. He was neither frightened nor especially surprised. If Karen had seen fit to propose buying his house for $1, it followed that she might escalate matters by involving the law. While one officer flipped open a notepad, Jared calmly recounted what had really happened. He explained that Karen had made an absurd dollar offer for his house, which he politely refused, and at no point had he ever threatened her. He shrugged, acknowledging that tensions between them had existed for a while, largely due to her numerous complaints about his garden decorations and sax playing. The officers exchanged glances, as though trying to reconcile Jared's mild demeanor with Karen's allegations of menacing behavior. Meanwhile, Karen started in on her dramatics. She insisted that Jared's refusal had been aggressive, that he'd loomed over her, raising his voice and causing her heart to pound in fear. She even claimed that he brandished his saxophone as though it were some sort of weapon, which Jared found almost comical were it not for the seriousness of the accusation. The second officer couldn't quite mask the flicker of doubt crossing his face. "I have the right to feel safe in my neighborhood," Karen declared, eyes flashing with righteous indignation. "He threatened me when I was only trying to help the community by improving property values." She went on, making references to random bylaw codes, though she provided no solid evidence. Her meltdown might have swayed the officers had Jared not previously displayed such a measured posture and calm explanation. As the questioning continued, the lead officer apologized to Jared for the inconvenience. He admitted that responding to a 911 call left them with little choice but to investigate. However, with no sign of aggression or tangible proof of wrongdoing, the matter appeared to be a standard dispute over property. They asked Jared if he'd mind stepping outside momentarily so they could speak with Karen alone. Jared obliged, understanding the routine. From the porch, he heard muffled voices as the officers conferred with Karen inside the living room. Judging by the volume of her protests, she wasn't satisfied that they hadn't instantly sided with her. Eventually, the group re-emerged, the officers wearing expressions of faint exasperation. They told Karen that without corroboration or signs of actual threat, they couldn't pursue charges. She huffed in frustration, then insisted they file an incident report anyway, just in case. After the patrol car pulled away, Karen cast Jared a venomous look. "This isn't over," she hissed, before storming off. The entire confrontation left Jared both drained and increasingly worried. If she was willing to claim emotional distress and brand him a threat, what else might she do if the HOA or anyone else gave her free rein? The incident also left Jared with the realization that random calls to the police could become a frequent affair. The friction had reached a level where his personal boundaries and the legitimacy of his own property rights were being challenged on a near-daily basis. That evening, he flipped through local bylaw documents, trying to figure out if there was a foolproof method to prevent Karen from repeatedly calling the authorities for trifling reasons. Some acquaintances advised him to file a complaint of his own, documenting each time she lodged a baseless accusation. Others suggested a restraining order, though Jared felt that might be too extreme unless she escalated further. As he considered these options, Jared found himself missing the simpler days of performing on stage. Back then, even the worst crowd was more straightforward to handle than a neighbor determined to meddle in every aspect of his domestic life. In concert halls, at least, there were clear rules of engagement, and applause was typically the only noise that greeted the end of a sax solo. Number 911 calls, no bizarre property offers, no theatrical claims of emotional harm. Ultimately, the officers left no real resolution behind. They had done their duty by responding, but the underlying conflict between Jared and Karen remained. With the seed of tension now thoroughly planted, Jared sensed the next chapters in this ordeal would force him to be more strategic. He needed to safeguard his personal freedom, his cherished home, and his ability to play his saxophone in peace, none of which was guaranteed as long as Karen saw every note he played or garden gnome he displayed as an affront to the order she believed she maintained. Though the police had left Elmwood Lane with no charges filed, Karen refused to let matters rest. She embarked on a campaign to retell the story of her intimidation at the hands of Jared Armstrong, weaving a narrative of aggression that could hardly be recognized by anyone who knew Jared's gentle temperament. Word spread quickly through the HOA grapevine and local social media pages, each retelling seemingly amplifying the danger and drama she claimed to have encountered in Jared's front yard. Confident in her ability to sway public opinion, Karen lined up supporters who, though they hadn't witnessed the alleged threats, were more than willing to parrot her account. She framed her refusal to pay more than $1 for Jared's property as a last-ditch attempt to safeguard the neighborhood's values. He could have chosen a graceful exit, she lamented to anyone who would listen. Instead, he terrorized me with that saxophone, using his music as a weapon of emotional warfare. The hyperbole was astonishing, but it caught the attention of a few who believed every word. Meanwhile, Jared, perplexed but resolute, carried on with daily life. He was no stranger to hearing tall tales. After all, he'd encountered plenty of boisterous fans and critics during his years on stage. But never had he been the focal point of such a local scandal. Karen's dramatic spin on events was deeply unsettling, especially when he spotted acquaintances casting wary glances his way, as if uncertain whether the mild-mannered saxophonist might truly be some unstoppable menace. Occasionally, neighbors approached Jared with caution, asking him to clarify the rumor that he brandished his saxophone in a threatening manner. At first, he tried to dismiss the notion with humor, "I guess she thinks I'd treat my sax like a shotgun." But realized that some folks were genuinely anxious. They mentioned seeing Karen's posts or hearing her speak passionately about how someone had to stand up to Jared's intimidation. The seeds of fear she planted spread far too easily, overshadowing the calm rationality that Jared hoped would prevail. Feeling the pressure, Jared reluctantly decided to address these rumors more actively. He organized a small get-together with a handful of neighbors who remained neutral. Hosting them for a casual coffee in his living room, he laid out exactly what had happened, the bizarre $1 offer, the refusal, and the subsequent 911 call. The group, which included a couple from down the street and an older woman who walked her dog past Jared's property each morning, listened intently. They seemed genuinely shocked by how drastically Karen had twisted the story. Armed with this honest retelling, a few neighbors took it upon themselves to correct the record whenever they heard the rumors repeated. They politely informed doubters that Jared had done nothing remotely aggressive. In fact, he'd been the picture of restraint when faced with an absurd property sale proposal. Bit by bit, this quiet counternarrative began to shine a more favorable light on Jared's situation, tempering the panic that Karen was trying to stoke. What Karen hadn't counted on was that many in the area admired Jared's musical flair and easygoing nature. Indeed, some found her dramatic retellings too extreme to swallow whole. As a result, her theatrical version of being driven to tears by a menacing sax player started losing traction with a growing swath of the community. Yet, this shift in perception didn't deter Karen from forging ahead with her cause. She doubled down, portraying any pushback as proof of a cover-up or conspiracy. The final blow to her credibility arrived one afternoon at a small neighborly gathering, ironically one that Karen had skipped. People collectively reviewed the various notes and messages she'd circulated about Jared, each more inflammatory than the last. By the time they finished reading, the group unanimously agreed that her claims were riddled with inconsistencies. One neighbor cracked a joke about how Jared, if truly so threatening, might at least attempt to charge more than $1 for his property. Laughter ensued, highlighting the absurdity of the entire fiasco. Despite this comedic relief, Jared couldn't entirely relax. He sensed that Karen's flair for drama often concealed deeper cunning. She relished playing the victim, a role that offered her moral high ground whenever confronted with contradictory facts. Even if public sentiment wavered, she might attempt fresh angles, like lodging new complaints with the HOA or hatching more elaborate stories about Jared's supposed misdeeds. In her mind, the bigger the performance, the more likely she could shame him into capitulation. Still, as Jared went to bed that night, he allowed himself a small smile, remembering how a few of the onlookers had reacted when they heard Karen's wild accusations. Time and truth, he realized, were gradually exposing her exaggerations. The question now was whether she'd let go of her obsession, or if the intensifying drama would ultimately push her toward even riskier gambits, and, in turn, whether Jared could continue countering her moves with the same calm determination that had kept him out of real trouble so far. In the weeks following Karen's latest round of dramatics, Jared Armstrong noted a peculiar shift on his property. One morning, while sipping coffee on his porch, he spied what looked like a small garter snake slithering across the path near his carefully trimmed hedges. At first, he chalked it up to normal countryside life. Elmwood Lane occasionally hosted wandering critters from the nearby fields. Yet, as the days passed, sightings of garden snakes multiplied, creeping closer and closer to his front door. Alarmed by the sudden proliferation, Jared tried to discreetly track their movements. He'd see them coiled under ornamental rocks, or squirming in the tall grass behind his hibiscus bushes. The situation wasn't dangerous in a conventional sense. These snakes weren't venomous or large, but their presence was enough to rattle him, considering he'd maintained the property for years without such an invasion. Suspecting foul play, he recalled Karen's words about forcing him to remove unwelcome decorations. Could she be behind this bizarre infiltration? His suspicions took on new weight when local wildlife authorities, responding to an anonymous tip, contacted Jared. They explained that someone had purchased and released a batch of harmless but invasive garden snakes, apparently with the goal of scaring off nuisance neighbors. The tipster had linked the transaction to an individual who matched Karen's general description. Everything pointed to a disturbing conclusion: she had gone so far as to bring live reptiles onto his land just to drive him away. For Jared, this revelation crossed a line. Complaints about gnomes and sax music were one thing, spreading slander was another, but actively dumping snakes was a calculated act of harassment. It heightened the tension to a new level, suggesting that Karen would resort to nearly any ploy to assert her will. During a weekend walkabout, he discovered small, makeshift snake release boxes partially concealed in the underbrush, confirming that this wasn't a random infestation but a planned sabotage. Uncertain how to proceed, Jared reached out to the local Humane Society, asking for advice on removing or relocating the snakes. The staff sympathized, offering humane traps and specialized guidance to corral the critters without harming them. Meanwhile, a friend quietly reminded him that if Karen had contravened animal welfare laws, there could be serious legal ramifications for her. The idea that the unstoppable busybody might face charges for her reptilian scheme felt both satisfying and surreal. Word traveled swiftly through the community after the wildlife sanctuary posted about an unusual snake relocation effort on Elmwood Lane. Some neighbors found the story too outlandish to believe. Who would go to such lengths over minor aesthetic disputes? Yet, for those who had witnessed Karen's penchant for hyperbole, the scenario rang true. A few folks approached Jared to apologize for ever doubting him, appalled that someone they once admired as a diligent HOA figure had resorted to borderline criminal pranks. The biggest shock, however, came when an officer named Ramirez, investigating the wildlife sanctuary's tip, arrived at Jared's door. Ramirez explained that enough evidence existed to implicate Karen in purchasing the snakes from a questionable online source. Not only was it a violation of local fauna regulations, but it also constituted trespassing and property damage if she released them with malicious intent. This news left Jared both relieved and anxious, relieved that law enforcement might intervene, anxious at how Karen might retaliate. He stared around at the ornamental statues, the lush hibiscus, and his battered saxophone case leaning by the doorstep. The notion that a petty feud could escalate to the release of living creatures seemed almost beyond reason. Yet here he was, living out a scenario that felt like a comedic short film. As he considered the possible outcomes, the officer added, "We're going to question her about this. You might want to be prepared for any further stunts she tries to pull." Sure enough, rumors swirled that Karen had been called in for questioning, though she'd apparently insisted on her innocence. Some said she maintained it was a misunderstanding, that she'd purchased the snakes to help with rodent control. Others whispered that she continued to insist Jared's yard was brimming with unholy activity that needed divine or reptilian intervention. The lines between rumor and reality blurred, but one fact stood out: the tide had turned. For the first time, official eyes were scrutinizing Karen, not Jared. Observing the swirling events, Jared felt a small surge of hope. If proof of her wrongdoing stuck, she might finally be held accountable for the stunts that had overshadowed their entire neighborhood. Yet, he refrained from celebration, mindful that she could still conjure fresh accusations if cornered. The entire fiasco reminded him of the unpredictability inherent in dealing with a neighbor who believed she was above the law, or the realm of decency. In the hush that followed the day's revelations, Jared carried on removing the last of the garden snakes with humane traps, returning them safely to a rescue group. The menacing presence they symbolized remained a stark reminder that his quiet existence had been shaken by a single person's relentless drive for control. As he locked his door that evening, Jared wondered if the end was near or if Karen still had cards left to play, cards that might push their once cordial neighborhood into an even deeper rift of bizarre confrontations. For all her dramatic flair and repeated calls to the authorities, Karen never expected that the tables would turn so abruptly. Yet that was precisely what transpired on a breezy, sunlit morning when Officer Delgado, the same officer who had once responded to her complaints about Jared Armstrong, arrived at her door, this time to serve a warrant for her arrest. The trigger had been the discovery of how far Karen had gone to orchestrate her campaign against Jared. While local law enforcement and the broader community were already weary of her theatrics, it was a tip from a wildlife office that proved her undoing. The official statement revealed she had purchased and released a swarm of harmless garden snakes onto Jared's property in an attempt to drive him away. That act of trespass, combined with the potential violation of animal welfare laws, was enough to warrant an investigation. As the pieces fell into place, a pattern of repeated harassment and false accusations emerged, underscored by the fiasco around her offering Jared $1 for his house and then alleging she was threatened when he refused. Standing on her manicured lawn, Karen gaped at Officer Delgado as he recited the charges against her: trespassing, property damage, and potential infractions related to introducing wildlife without proper authorization. The moment was surreal, reversing the roles of complaint lodger and suspect in a single stroke. She began spouting a string of protests about how this was a misunderstanding, even going so far as to claim the snakes were part of a rodent control effort. But Delgado only shook his head. There was ample evidence contradicting her explanation. Word of Karen's arrest spread swiftly through the neighborhood. News that the longtime HOA champion, once so vocal about the slightest deviation from community standards, was now in legal trouble made for a hot topic of conversation. Some residents greeted the development with silent schadenfreude, recalling the trivial and sometimes downright absurd complaints Karen had lodged against them. Others, who had admired her zeal for order, were perplexed, struggling to reconcile their image of Karen as an overenthusiastic caretaker with the news of her meddling in ways that broke the law. Meanwhile, Jared found an odd mix of relief and amusement. The same neighbor who had tried to paint him as a villain in the eyes of the community was being marched out in handcuffs by an officer she'd once viewed as an ally. He couldn't help but recall the day she offered him $1 for his house, an insult that had teetered on the edge of a comedic skit. Now, ironically, she was the one facing actual legal consequences. Although he didn't revel in her downfall, he was human enough to feel a certain vindication. The local press took interest in the case, publishing short columns about the HOA officials' unusual tactics. The story, featuring references to garden snakes and a $1 property offer, captured attention beyond their tranquil suburb. A few outlets tried to sensationalize it: saxophonist skeptical showdown with harsh HOA, or the gnome guarding musician versus the snake deploying president. Jared, preferring to keep his personal affairs as private as possible, politely declined interviews. Still, news traveled, and soon the entire fiasco became local folklore. Karen's attorney argued strenuously for her release pending a hearing, framing her actions as a series of misunderstandings. Yet the bail hearing brought up not only her serpent scandal but also the repeated false police calls and baseless accusations of aggression against Jared. The court saw a consistent pattern of harassment and potential intimidation, making it challenging for her to downplay the seriousness. While she awaited her trial date, the HOA promptly convened a meeting to address her status. In one decisive move, they voted to suspend Karen from any official capacity pending the outcome of the legal proceedings. All of this left a sizable power vacuum in the HOA, prompting residents to reflect on how they'd allowed her so much influence. The revelation that Karen had crossed clear ethical lines, to the point of criminal charges, sparked discussions about revising HOA bylaws, ensuring that no single individual could again exploit the system for a personal vendetta. Some neighbors, still loyal to Karen, tried to maintain her innocence. But the majority recognized that her extreme measures indicated a deeper personal agenda, unhinged from any genuine concern for community well-being. Jared, for his part, moved forward cautiously. Even with Karen under legal scrutiny, he recognized that controversies have a habit of rearing up unexpectedly. Her supporters could still direct new accusations or rally around claims of a conspiracy. Nonetheless, he was heartened by the blossoming sense of collective introspection. Neighbors who once turned a blind eye to her complaints were now questioning how they'd allowed such behaviors to go unchallenged. In the quiet that followed her arrest, Jared strolled through his yard, reappreciating the peace that initially drew him to this corner of suburbia. Though the saga was hardly over, Karen's trial and potential punishment still loomed, he at least felt a measure of validation. He had stood his ground, defending his right to display garden gnomes, cultivate hibiscus, and play his saxophone in the early evening. Most importantly, he hadn't folded under the weight of ludicrous offers and manipulative threats. While the next steps hinged on the legal process, Jared sensed that the tide had turned. Instead of being under constant siege, he found himself the unwitting hero of a story that both baffled and entertained onlookers, a story that proved even the quietest musician could face down the loudest neighbor if armed with patience and principle. The sight of Karen being escorted away by law enforcement quickly became the talk of Elmwood Lane, and, in a surprising twist, vaulted Jared Armstrong to a level of local fame he never expected. While Karen dealt with bail conditions and the looming specter of trial, Jared found himself the subject of neighborhood speculation and mild adoration. Some referred to him jokingly as the saxophone knight, praising him for standing firm against an individual who used intimidation and lawsuits as routine weapons. Word reached him that a few towns over, a small newspaper published a human interest piece about the gnome-loving jazzman, painting a whimsical portrait of how a kindly ex-musician outsmarted the area's most meddlesome neighbor. Even in local coffee shops, strangers approached him with curiosity. "Aren't you the one with the dollar house fiasco? Or, didn't you face charges from that overzealous HOA lady?" Each time, Jared offered a modest smile, clarifying the real story when needed. Meanwhile, Karen faced an array of legal consequences. Besides the potential penalties tied to her snake-related trespassing and attempts at intimidation, she was fined for misusing HOA resources to push her personal vendettas. Perhaps most humiliating for her, the court mandated community service at a wildlife sanctuary, an ironic fate, given how she had introduced reptiles to Jared's yard to begin with. Instead of scheduling more neighborhood compliance checks, she spent her mornings feeding rescued birds of prey and cleaning enclosures. Throughout this period, Jared remained genial, focusing on the simpler joys of life. He accepted a few more housewarming invitations from neighbors who'd once kept their distance. They commended his calm in the face of Karen's relentless campaign. Some claimed they initially believed her stories, only to realize the extent of her exaggerations after witnessing her meltdown. Freed from the oppressive oversight she once commanded, the HOA itself transformed. Less prone to petty squabbles, more tolerant of personal expression. In private moments, Jared found humor in the entire situation. The bizarre chain of events, a single-dollar property offer, false accusations of aggression, snake sabotage, read like an outlandish script. Occasionally, the whimsy lingered in his mind, particularly when he recalled how the final act played out, Karen cuffed by her own frequent collaborator, the local police. The tension that once occupied Elmwood Lane had evaporated, replaced by a cautious sort of levity. Now, an unexpected hero to some and a cautionary figure to others, Jared resumed his daily saxophone practice, letting melodic tunes float across the suburban silence. Gnomes remained stationed around his lawn, and the hibiscus bushes continued to bloom in vibrant reds and pinks, defying the previously threatened guidelines. Yes, there were still occasional stares from passers-by, but the undercurrent of conflict had eased. Jared was content to let the story of his improbable standoff live on as neighborhood lore, hopeful that the final chapters of Karen's legal entanglements would ensure no more midnight police arrivals over trifling concerns. While Karen was out on bail and forced to complete community service, she still held on to remnants of her old tactics. One afternoon, Jared Armstrong discovered a letter slipped under his front door. It bore the distinct letterhead of a local law firm. Upon opening it, he recognized Karen's handiwork immediately. The letter demanded, in formal legal jargon, that Jared remove his garden gnomes and cease playing his saxophone, citing emotional distress and maintaining neighborhood harmony as justifications. Though it startled Jared to receive what amounted to a cease and desist, he couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity. Here was someone who was under legal scrutiny for her acts of trespassing and harassment, still trying to wield her old methods of intimidation. The letter threatened further litigation if he didn't comply, highlighting how guests and visitors to the area have been traumatized by his yard ornaments and unpredictable musical performances. Jared rolled his eyes. No doubt these claims were as baseless as her earlier allegations. Some neighbors, upon learning of the letter, advised Jared to ignore it, believing Karen lacked any standing to make such demands. Others urged him to consult with a lawyer of his own, just to keep the record straight. "Better safe than sorry," said one man who had personally endured Karen's mania for petty lawsuits. Jared, never a fan of legal entanglements, reluctantly agreed that a consultation wouldn't hurt. Still, the entire situation felt like a twisted joke. Even as local courts deliberated on Karen's offenses, she continued pressing for a brand of order that defied logic. Having worn the brunt of her vitriol for months, Jared refused to let the new letter rattle him. In fact, he saw an opening. If she insisted on continuing her mission to eradicate garden gnomes and sax solos, he might respond in kind, albeit more creatively and within legal bounds. After all, there was no reason he had to remain strictly on the defensive. That evening, Jared prepared a calm, measured response, typed up on his computer. He laid out that he lived in full compliance with the HOA guidelines, had never received a single validated complaint about noise or yard decorations from any official channel, and maintained the right to personal expression on his property. As for the traumatizing nature of his saxophone music, he found no precedents in local or state statutes banning instruments for personal enjoyment. If Karen's letter was meant to break his resolve, it failed. Instead, it emboldened Jared to consider turning the tables more decisively. He concluded that it might be time for a new strategy, one that, if all else failed, would highlight Karen's hypocrisy by using the very same methods she'd always employed, a mixture of audacity and unwavering confidence. And with that plan forming, Jared braced for the final showdown he suspected was inevitable between him and a neighbor who simply refused to quit. The tension reached a crescendo when Karen's lawyer doubled down, threatening to escalate the matter if Jared Armstrong didn't conform to their demands, essentially, removing his beloved garden gnomes and giving up saxophone playing for good. In response, Jared proposed an unconventional countermeasure, drawing on both his wit and years of stage experience. He vowed to perform a morning saxophone serenade right outside Karen's windows each day unless she dropped the claims. It might have sounded outlandish, but from Jared's perspective, if Karen wanted to weaponize legal letters and contrived complaints, he could employ a more musical approach. He had no intention of truly harassing her. The notion of waking up to a jazz standard at daybreak was more a symbolic gesture, a reminder that her intimidation tactics could be matched with an equal measure of audacity. The threat landed exactly as intended. Within hours, a new letter arrived, this time from the lawyer, retracting their earlier demands. While the formal language shielded them from acknowledging defeat, it was obvious that neither Karen nor her attorney wished to test the power of an unrestrained saxophone each morning. After all, local regulations permitted daytime music, so she couldn't accuse him of breaking noise laws if he timed his practice sessions within allowed hours. For Jared, the outcome was quietly triumphant. His garden gnomes remained perched in their whimsical spots, the hibiscus bushes maintained their bright colors, and his saxophone playing proceeded without impediment. The final showdown turned out less dramatic than some neighbors anticipated, no grand yelling match in the street, no flurry of last-minute police calls. Instead, it was resolved via a mutual understanding that pushing the conflict further would only yield more headaches for everyone. Though he felt some relief, Jared maintained a realistic outlook. Karen, having shown a remarkable capacity for stirring ruble, might resurface with a new angle if she felt cornered. But for the moment, the neighborhood seemed to settle into an uneasy peace, one that allowed Jared to slip back into the life he truly cherished, cultivating his yard and letting the gentle flow of saxophone notes drift across the suburban air. Word spread throughout Elmwood Lane of how Jared negotiated with music, and the story took on a light-hearted quality in local gossip. People found it both amusing and instructive, that a calm, creative approach could outmaneuver rigid intimidation tactics. In a sense, Jared had turned the tables not by matching hostility with hostility, but by highlighting the absurdity of it all, coaxing the other side to recognize that continuing the battle would result only in further embarrassment. With this final resolution in place, Jared resumed his personal routines, still watchful of any simmering tension. A part of him remained on guard, yet a newfound ease settled over his home. He'd stood firm against a volley of petty demands and managed to keep his cherished lifestyle intact. That sense of continuity, of preserving the small joys of gnomes, flowers, and sax notes, was perhaps the sweetest reward of the entire conflict.